Okay, I've wanted to do this study for a while, and I I know that it's an intimidating book when you try to start reading the book of Ezekiel. There's a lot of things that make it a challenge, and I thought I'm going to try to go through a lot of the highlights of this book. I think it's an important book, but it's a strange book. And that's why I use the word esoteric as kind of the title for this study, because some of the information in it, I think, is given in symbolic form as almost a secret code to those that were trying to look for hope to come back from exile. It's a warning in many respects to the people that are surviving a particular invasion by Nebuchadnezzar. And so we'll get into that in due time. So this is going to be our winter spring study, and it'll take us probably about 3 months, I imagine, to hit some of the highlights of it over the coming weeks. So, having said that, here's what I'd like to do tonight. I want to just give you some background information that I think will help you understand once we kind of delve into some of the chapters in the weeks ahead. So, with that in mind, here's how I'd like for us to begin tonight. I want to begin, first of all, with an introduction to Ezekiel. The book, first of all, tells us about an individual we don't know a whole lot about. From the time Ezekiel was commissioned as a prophet, he has a real difficult task. And the difficult task, I think, is trying to dismantle the mindset of those that are facing the hardship that they are currently experiencing. And the way to kind of summarize this, and I'll have this a couple times in the course of the study, and you'll get it in a future handout. But if you were to look at what the people believed on the ground that Ezekiel is trying to minister to, I might I might say there's like four big points of their particular viewpoint of God at this point in their history. Number one is this: they believed they were God's chosen people and they were to enjoy the covenant blessings over the other nations. Now, that's part of the mentality that you find all through the Old Testament. We are God's chosen people. God is going to treat us favorably. He's going to protect us. He's going to be at our beck and call. And I think that's kind of at the heart of the problem in the Old Testament is almost seeing God as a patron deity that is basically there to serve one nation only. That's Israel. A second thing is they believe that God granted them certain land grants and that they were to be protected from defeat of any enemy. Now, the problem is Ezekiel has already seen that they have lost some things, and they also know that the northern kingdom, after the split, the 12 tribes split into two, 10 to the north, two to the south. The two to the south, called Judah, were able to survive longer than the 10 tribes to the north. Assyria had already taken the 10 tribes into exile. But for whatever reason, they believed God was going to protect them from the same thing happening to them. Number three, they believed God promised them a Davidic dynasty in perpetuity. In other words, we're always going to have a descendant of David on the throne, and nothing's going to interrupt that. Well, as we know in subsequent history, they not only don't have a Davidic dynasty, they don't have any dynasty, as they are under oppression for four successive empires. And then finally, number four, they believe David's kingly rule on earth was a manifestation of God's heavenly rule. So when you look at David's kingdom and the kings that represent the Davidic dynasty, what you are seeing is a manifestation of God's will on earth. So These four things, I think, is kind of the worldview that Ezekiel's going to work against in his scroll. And I think keeping this in the back of our mind, and again, I'll give this to you in next week's handout, will help us to understand some of the visions that are very confusing when we first read them. So let me come back to this slide. When you take a look at chapter 1 through 3, you have kind of a microcosm of the entire book. The first thing you notice in chapter 1 is a vision, and we'll get to that next week. It's a strange vision. It can come out of a fantasy type a literature that would be appealing to be just because it's mesmerizing. Chapters 2 and 3, Ezekiel is commanded to digest a scroll of the material he is to communicate, which is a part of his prophetic calling. And when you take those 3 chapters together, what you find is God is giving him visions from above. He is to make it a part of who he is, and then he is to communicate that to his fellow Israelites that have been taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar back to the land of Babylon, which I'll get to in a moment. So you can interrupt me anytime if you have a question or insight or comment. So the scroll of Ezekiel has some wisdom for us. It's not just something isolated to the Old Testament. And ironically enough, I don't want to begin in Ezekiel. I want to begin in Luke chapter 24 for a moment. In the story of Jesus' resurrection, there's an interesting encounter in chapter 24 of 2 disciples that are walking along the Emmaus Road. And they are downtrodden and sad in heart because they did not expect Jesus, the so-called Messiah of the Jewish people, to be executed. They are devastated by what has happened. And when you look at the conversation taking place in Luke chapter 24, it's interesting. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but in summary, when Jesus appears to them on the Emmaus Road, he is hidden from their understanding and recognition. Now, that in itself is kind of interesting. Why didn't they recognize him? Jesus will comment that his people were slow to believe, that they were people that had this particular mindset that I just shared with you, that God is on our side, and when he does send the Messiah, he's going to lead us to military victory. And then he says something in Luke chapter 24, beginning in verse 25. He says this, and this is where it's intriguing for us. He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Now, that's a fascinating statement. So he doesn't go through the prophets one verse at a time, but he says kind of a synthesis of the prophets is that the core themes are there for you to recognize if you are not slow to believe. Now, that includes Ezekiel. Whatever Ezekiel has to communicate, it's a part of this core synthesis of this collection of the prophets that is pointing to Jesus. And somehow, an understanding of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is kind of baked in to what the prophets are doing. So keep that in the back of your mind when we're reading certain sections of Ezekiel. How does this play into the overall understanding of Messiah and his relationship with the people who were expecting him to come and deliver them from the current oppressor, the Roman Empire? So, with that in mind, we're going to move to Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. So when you come to Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, I'm just going to read it, and then we're going to take a look back at Second Kings. So we're going to move to another passage of scripture that's going to give us a little bit of background. But here's what the introduction to Ezekiel says. It says, "In my 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day, while I was among the exiles by the Kebar River, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. Now, on the 5th of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, by the Kebar River in the land of the Babylonians. There, the hand of the Lord was on him. I looked, saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal." And then it will go on and it'll get more detailed. I want to stop right there. So, in this introduction to the book of Ezekiel, the first thing you're going to notice is it begins in the first person. In verses 2 and 3, it goes to third person, and then it comes back to first person. So it begins with Ezekiel telling the story, and then it's interrupted by an editor. And the editor is giving us a third person piece of information so that we kind of understand the setting of Ezekiel. Then it comes back to the first person in verse 4. I looked, I saw, I experienced, those type of things. So in those 4 verses, you're going to notice at the very beginning of Ezekiel, several things jump out. The first thing you're going to notice are some dates. In the 30th year, the 4th month, the 5th day, on the 5th of the month. So we are given a compass point to be able to kind of know the setting of the book. Second thing, there's some obscure locations that are mentioned. He is by the Kebar River. Nobody knows where that's at. No one knows what that is. What is the Kebar River? It's not the Nile River. It's not the Euphrates River. A lot of scholars think that this might be an irrigation canal that kind of feeds into the city, and it's a place where some of the exiles go to pray. Then there's a key vision. The heavens were open, and I saw the vision of God. Okay, so right in the beginning, so there's some dates, there's some obscure locations that are mentioned, and a key vision. Then there's some clarifying notes that are given. A little bit about Ezekiel, because we don't know anything about Ezekiel, really. But what we're told is that he's the son of Buzi, who was a priest. So that would make him a priest as well. So in this book, he's a prophet, but that's not his first vocation. Then the story begins. The hand of the Lord was on him, and then the heavens open up, and then there's all kinds of things. There's a whirlwind from the north. There's a immense cloud. There's lightning. There's a bright light, those type of things. And then following that, some of the symbolism begins, because when you begin to read into the rest of chapter 1, after verse 4, you come down to verse 5, and it says, "In the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings." And at that point, you go, uh-oh, we're into confusing information here. What does this represent? What is the symbolism that's involved in this vision that is given to him? Well, we're going to really camp on this vision next week. But dates, locations, vision, clarifying notes, the beginning of the story of Ezekiel, and then the symbolism that's going to occur throughout really the whole book of Ezekiel. So, a couple of key takeaways, at least at this point. The composer of and editor of Ezekiel is going to try to coordinate what's in the book within the larger story of the Hebrew Bible. And in particular, it's going to be connected to the events that are recorded in 2 Kings. Secondly, we're going to find out very quickly that Ezekiel is a war refugee and he's being held captive. So I was just watching the news before we got online here, and a peace deal was struck between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and here are these captives that have been held for over a year and a half now, and over the next 6 weeks, supposedly they're going to be released. That is kind of the situation of Ezekiel. He is being held captive. He's been stripped of his social standing, really, as a priest. He's the son of a priest named Buzzy. He's living in a foreign land. The prophets talk a lot about the exile. It's a common theme in the Old Testament. What's unique about Ezekiel is he's living in a window of time between two tragedies, between the first invasion of Nebuchadnezzar into Jerusalem and the second invasion that is about to take place. And so his job is going to tell his fellow exiles that as bad as it was that Nebuchadnezzar came into Jerusalem and carted off a lot of the important people back to Babylon, there's an even greater tragedy that's on the horizon, because the next time Nebuchadnezzar invades Jerusalem, it will be destroyed. The temple will be destroyed as well. So, with that in mind, we come now to the question, well, who is Ezekiel? Well, he's an Israelite. He's sitting beside an irrigation canal in the land of Babylon. He's a priest by vocation, but he's living among a group of exiles, wondering, when are we going to be able to go home? And he has the terrible task of telling his fellow exiles, you're not going home, at least not yet, because there's tragedy on the horizon. To understand that, what we need to do is to understand this right here. So, in the book of Ezekiel, there's kind of a mixture of voices. You see that already in the first 4 verses. I, Ezekiel, and then it says, on the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel. So there's another voice that's speaking into the text as well. And this particular book, the scroll of Ezekiel, is a part of the prophets. Okay, so the way the Jewish people consider the organization of their writings is the Torah, first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The prophets, including both major and minor prophets that we have in our Old Testament, and the writings. And those are the other types of literature, like the Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon and those type of things. Now, in the prophets, you have 4 major prophets. You have Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And then you have the minor prophets. Not that they're less important than the major prophets, but by the amount of material that is written, that's the way they're categorized. So when you then look at these prophets, there is a hyperlink symbolically speaking, back to the times in the historical books of Joshua through the book of Kings. Now, this will also include in First and Second Chronicles, but First and Second Chronicles is a repetition with a different twist as the book of Kings. This hyperlink, ancient hyperlink, is sort of like a director's cut in a movie. It's going to be a flashback so that you kind of understand what's going on. So we've all watched movies where if you didn't have those director cuts that are integrated into the movie, you're not going to know what's going on. So there's flashbacks that remind us of how the people got there. So this particular slide in verses 1 and 4, first person narrative, Ezekiel, verses 2 and 3, a commentator that is giving to us a hyperlink, if you will, a director's cut to help us see why things are the way they are. So let me stop there and see if you have a question or comment. Is there anything I can clarify at this point? Okay. So the backstory to the book of Ezekiel is actually in Second Kings. So I'm going to invite you to go back to Second Kings chapter 24. And I'm going to read the whole chapter, and I'm just going to point out a couple of things as we move along here. So when you get to Second Kings chapter 24, you have to understand a little bit of what has already happened. So the 10 tribes to the north have already been taken away by the Assyrian Empire. Assyria was the dominant empire until Babylon started to rise up in power. And as Babylon arose, what you find is there is a battle that is going on for control of the Fertile Crescent. So you have Assyria, you have Babylon, and you have Egypt to the south. That's important to keep in mind. So now we drop in to the history of the kings in the south, the kings of Judah. And it begins in verse 1. It says, during Jehoiakim's reign, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, invaded the land. And Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years. So they've been conquered. The king is allowed to stay in his position, but he must pledge loyalty to Nebuchadnezzar. But then he turned against Nebuchadnezzar and rebelled. So now we're told he's tired of the tribute that he's paying, and he decides he's going to align. What you don't know at this point quite yet is with whom he's going to align with, but he aligns with another dominant power. Verse 2. The Lord sent the Lord sent Babylonian army. That's interesting. The Lord sent Babylonian, Aramean, Moabite, and Ammonite raiders against him to destroy Judah in accordance with the word of the Lord proclaimed by the servants, the prophets. Now, the prophets had been warning for a long time, hey, if you're not faithful to the covenant, God is going to send a foreign power to bring punishment. So here we find the perspective of the writer of Second Kings. He says, okay, these people are in alliance, the Babylonians, the Armenians, the Moabites, and the Ammonites. And if the Israelites, or Judahites, rather, is more specific, were wise, they would have stayed with this alliance. But they decided to break away. And as a result, there's this coalition that is going to invade into the land. Verse 3, surely these things happened to Judah according to the Lord's command in order to remove them from his presence because of the sins of Manasseh and all he had done, including the shedding of innocent blood. For he had filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord was not willing to forgive. So the commentators saying all of this is happening because of the actions of the leadership, the politicians. As for the other events of Jehoiakim's reign and all he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? Jehoiakim rested with his ancestors, and Jehoiachin, his son, succeeded him as king. The king of Egypt did not march out from his own country again. Now Egypt is being introduced because the king of Babylon had taken away all his territory from the Wadi of Egypt to the Euphrates River. So they had lost. So there's a battle that takes place between the Babylonians and the Egyptians. And as a result of that, the Egyptians lose some of their territory. Then it goes on. Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. His mother's name was Nehushta, daughter of Elnathan, and she was from Jerusalem. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as his fathers had done. And at that time, the officers of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, advanced on Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And Nebuchadnezzar himself came up to the city while his officers were besieging it. Jehoiachin, king of Judah, his mother, his attendants, his nobles, and his officials all surrendered to him. In the 8th year of the reign of the king of Babylon, he took Jehoiachin prisoner. As the Lord had declared, Nebuchadnezzar removed the treasures from the temple of the Lord and from the royal palace and cut up the gold articles that Solomon, king of Israel, had made for the temple of the Lord. He carried all Jerusalem into exile, all the officials and fighting men and all the skilled workers and artisans, a total of 10,000 people, including Ezekiel. Only the poorest people of the land were left. They're no threat, right? You leave the poor behind, they're not going to rebel. Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiachin captive to Babylon. He also took from Jerusalem to Babylon the king's mother, his wives, his officials, the prominent people of the land. The king of Babylon also deported to Babylon the entire force of 7,000 fighting men, strong and fit for war, and 1,000 skilled workers and artisans. He made Mattaniah, Jehoiachin's uncle, king in his place, and changed his name to Zedekiah. So now he leaves behind a puppet ruler by the name of Zedekiah. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. So we're doing a little bit of math here of his age and how long he reigned. His mother's name was Hamutal, daughter of Jeremiah. She was from Libnah. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as Jehoiakim had done. And it was because of the Lord's anger that all this happened to Jerusalem and Judah. And in the end, he thrust them from his presence. Now Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. He didn't learn. So, chapter 25 says, So in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. He encamped outside the city and built siege works all around it. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. And by the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the land had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. They broke through the city wall, and you can continue to read into chapter 25. In the end, Zedekiah's sons are killed so that there would not be an heir to the throne. And after Zedekiah's sons are killed, before his very eyes, Zedekiah's eyes were gouged out, so that would be the very last thing he would ever see, was the killing of his sons. So ruthless. So how do we summarize this? Ezekiel is one of those prominent people taken to Babylon. So here you see on the screen, Babylon appointed this puppet ruler, Zedekiah, and he ruled for 9.5 years. And as long as he was in allegiance with Nebuchadnezzar, he was okay. We're told, and this is in Ezekiel, not in 2 Kings, in Ezekiel 17, verse 15, that he decides he's going to rebel against Babylon. This will begin a second siege of the city, and basically Babylon's going to starve out the city. He besieges Jerusalem for a 1.5 years until the city basically collapsed from food and water shortages and stuff. Now, what we find taking place is Ezekiel's living in this window between the first invasion and the second invasion of Jerusalem. And it is his artist's task of telling his fellow Israelites that the second invasion is coming. Well, what's wrong with Zedekiah? He didn't learn from history? No. He he had people in his ears. He had pro-Babylonian advisors, he had pro-Egyptian advisors, and they're both speaking into his ears at the same time. And what happens is he decides and is persuaded to change allegiance to Egypt rather than to Babylon. So here's the essential plot conflict that you find in the book of Ezekiel. So the story, God promises in the Abrahamic covenant blessings to his people, including certain land promises and so forth. And if you remember in the Abrahamic covenant, he is blessed to become a blessing. When you go back to Genesis chapter 12, it's not just for the Israelites only, it's for all the nations to be blessed, to be able to bring some type of order out of the world. And God is going to use the Israelites to be a blessing to the rest of the world. The crisis, though, is the nation of Israel continues to break the covenant by following after other gods. Now, in other studies we have mentioned, it's not unusual that the Israelites had a multitude of gods, making Yahweh their prominent God. But at the same time, what we find is them worshiping these other deities. And as a result, at least the commentators of the Old Testament are suggesting this is why this invasion happened. It raises all kinds of questions, though. Would God really allow his people to be decimated and sent into exile? Is this going against anything that he had promised to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and the initial recipients of the covenant? Would he really destroy the temple that Solomon built? Isn't that the place? Isn't that the Lord's house where he dwells? Does this mean God is breaking his promises to Abraham and then subsequently to David? Is there any hope for any future covenant that God will make between himself and Israel? And how will Israel ever be a faithful covenant partner? Will she continue to commit adultery with other gods? And will Eden ever be recovered? Will this idea of on earth as it is in heaven ever be realized? So that's kind of the central conflict that you find in Ezekiel. So this here, and I won't read the whole thing, there's some scripture verses if you want to take the time to look them up. But if you're looking for a chronology, which is how we are wired as Westerners, okay, when did this happen? And that type of thing. Ezekiel's born in 623 BCE, and you find a succession of different kings, and Josiah being prominent is trying to bring the people back into covenant faithfulness. 10 tribes go to the north. In 612, 605 is when Nebuchadnezzar defeats the Egyptians at a battle called Carchemish. And then you have this Babylonian attack on Jerusalem because of a failure of alliance with the Babylonians. Zedekiah is the puppet king in 595. And then in 593, right here, 593 BCE, is when Ezekiel has his first vision of this godlike mobile of that we'll see next week that he sees and describes, which is very strange, but I think when we look at it, we'll be able to break it down next week to make some sense out of it. Then Nebuchadnezzar invades again. Jerusalem falls in 586 BCE. Ezekiel has another vision. This time it's in the latter part of the book, chapters 40 through 48, a vision of another temple. And then finally, the Babylonian Empire in 538 BCE is toppled by the Medo-Persian Empire, the ruler being Cyrus. And then in 520 BCE, Cyrus is going to allow a first wave of exiles to go back to the land of Jerusalem, which is found in the book of Ezra, chapters 1 through 6. Okay, so if you were to look at the book in kind of a literary design, you could probably break it down like this. In chapters 1 through 11, you have this vision of God's presence, but there is going to be the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. The second section of the book in chapters 12 through 33 is a number of poems and parables and signs that are given, warning of this coming destruction. And then finally, in chapters 34 through 48, you have promises of vindication and restoration for Israel. And you have this vision of a heavenly temple that will be given as part of God's final victory over evil and the nations that bring it upon his people. So with that in mind, I'm going to change directions a little bit here, but I want to see if you have any questions to this point. Is there anything that I can clarify for you?
When did Ezekiel officially become a prophet? Is he a prophet? Go from a priest to a prophet because he had a vision? What made him a prophet?
Yeah, I think when you come into the book of Ezekiel, he assumes the role of prophet because he's been given these visions. So that's not his initial vocation. He's basically a priest that has been carted off to this foreign land. It's only when the heavens are open, and as it says in verse 1 of Ezekiel chapter 1, that he has these visions and that the Lord touches him by this, that he is told that he is to communicate this information to the other exiles that are there. So the way to think about it is he's a priest that becomes a prophet, and the visions become the prompter to assume this new role. Does that help at all? Okay. All right. Okay, so what you're going to come up against in the book of Ezekiel, um, we call them visions using biblical terminology. But there's other ways of people evaluating what Ezekiel is going through. And there's a term that is thrown around among the academic community called the altered state of consciousness, or ASC. And this became a more prominent term among psychologists and other people in the field of psychiatry, that type of thing, that became kind of a replacement term for words like ecstasy, a trance, hallucination, or even a mystical experience. So it's the idea that someone can enter into an altered state of consciousness. Um, it's not a dream. They're awake, but it's something that they see or it's something that they feel. And so when we talk about visions that are given to the prophets, um, is this an alternate state of consciousness, to use kind of a more updated terminology? Well, you have to ask the question, what is this altered state of consciousness all about? Academics will say the ASC is kind of characterized by changes in senses, perceiving, thinking, and feeling. So, in other words, they see something, they feel something, they believe something to be true, to be realistic, that it's really there. Now, I've shared with you in recent weeks that that my dad is having some hallucinations. Um, okay, is that an alternate state of consciousness? Well, I'm not educated enough to be able to put that term on it, but it's some of the things he's seeing, some of the things he's thinking, some of the things he's feeling, he thinks is real. It's as real as anything else that we are looking at right now or hearing. So, what the academic community says is these are kind of different states in which um, people kind of relate to the world in a different way, maybe even in a sense to themselves. So, there's both kind of a supernaturalistic and naturalistic versions that are kind of given to altered state of consciousness. Supernaturalistic is this idea of the heavens are open, I see this, I feel this, I hear this. Naturalistic might be something more of kind of feeling a sense of something, the presence of something, um, the awareness that something else is going on beyond what's happening in the moment. And both of these elements are connected in the Bible to the supernatural elements primarily. So when you think about the ancient Near East, you will have the belief in invisible spirits, things that cannot be seen, touched, or felt. Um, that brings us back to Luke chapter 24. Excuse me. Is that kind of the state that these two disciples on the Emmaus Road are experiencing, at least for a while, um, as they are talking with someone that they don't recognize? Or is that something that's happening in the moment? When Jesus breaks the bread, to finish Luke chapter 24, their eyes are opened and then he vanishes from their sight. So this is a post-resurrection appearance, but it's also interesting as to how it plays out in the minds of the two disciples on the Emmaus Road. Um, when we talk about the supernatural could be anything that transcends the empirical. That is the things that we normally experience and see and feel and taste and touch and that type of thing. So, with that in mind, what you have is these visions that are given to Ezekiel. Are they some form of ASC? Another way a scholar describes it in a book of the same name is the flight of the soul. That is, that the soul is taken to another place. That's kind of the language that the Apostle Paul uses when he talks about knowing a man that was caught up to the third heaven. Did he go there physically, or was this a flight of the soul of something that he experienced? So we'll be coming back to some of these things as we talk about the visions and what they represent. But at this point, when you look at the life of Ezekiel and some of the visions that he had been given, you'll find that many of the visions, not only with Ezekiel, but also with Daniel and even John the Revelator in the book of Revelation, are sometimes considered what is called astral prophets. That is, their visions come out of the heavens, that there's some tradition of light that is being seen from the heavens, and there is some connection sometimes to the stars and constellations that are in the sky. And I think that might play in to us understanding a little bit better the first vision of Ezekiel, which I'll talk about next week. The aim of this first paragraph of Ezekiel is basically to orient us to this prophet and what are his historical situations and what his role was initially. He's at least 30 years old. We're told in Numbers chapter 4, verse 30, that that's the age at which priests assumed office. So if he was a priest, he's over the age of 30. He's not a teenager. He's not like Daniel. Daniel's much younger. And even the three teenagers, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in the book of Daniel are quite young. What we are told about Ezekiel is that there are some dates that are connected here, and you can go back to that chronology I gave to you earlier. But at this point, the heavens were opened, verse 1 tells us. And he's beginning to peer into the divine abode in the heavens above. God kind of opens the sky for him to be able to see what others cannot see. In that, Ezekiel is not just drawing upon his experience. Ezekiel is probably a very educated man. He's an individual that probably drew upon many different sources. He is an individual that was considered part of the upper crust. That's why he was taken into exile in the first place. Some of the things that he could have drawn on that will appear in the book are pieces of poetry, his own experiences, hearing God through some type of audible message. And then you'll notice in verse 3, this is interesting, it keeps repeating in the book. In verse 3, it says, there the hand of the Lord was on him. You'll find that in chapter 3, verse 14, and verse 22, and chapter 8, chapter 33, and chapter 37. The same phrase, there the hand of the Lord was on him. So when you look at this inaugural vision, and we're going to have to explain it next week, we're given an introduction, and then he sees living creatures and spinning wheels, and he is given a vision of a platform with a throne upon it, and finally a conclusion. So what we're going to do is look at that next week. So what I'd like for you to do between now and next Wednesday is to read chapter 1. Use a pencil, circle some things that jump out at you, some things that are questions or things that are confusing, which there should be a lot of things that are confusing to you in this inaugural vision. But what are some of the things that you perceive? Now, go back to the ASC. It's interesting in neuroscience that some of the things that are recorded that people see in these altered states of consciousness include some of the things that are here in chapter 1. Bright colors, geometric shapes, and bizarre beings. They're categorized as stage 1, 2, and 3 in these alternate state of consciousness. Maybe what's happening here is a 3-stage process that Ezekiel is going through. And then, so when you read chapter 1, look for color, look for geometric shapes, and look for bizarre beings, okay? Circle them. Now, this first prophetic experience is really graphic, more so than other visions that were given to Moses, as in Exodus 3 or Isaiah in chapter 6 of his book. The Jewish Study Bible has a comment. Ezekiel comes as close as possible to seeing God. That's a fascinating statement. Remember Moses, when he saw God pass by, the commentator says he saw God's backside. That's an interesting comment as well. Here, Jewish scholars think that he is seeing the very throne room of God in Technicolor, that this vision is going to propel him to communicate in such a way to the others that will be the recipients of his vision. So, what I want to do tonight, so you have a better way of bringing it all together, is some of my favorite information comes from these summary videos that come from the Bible Project. So we're going to watch that, and then what we're going to do is we'll see if you have any questions or comments before we close out the night. So here's the Bible Project, not summarizing the whole book, but the first half of Ezekiel. Let's watch together.
The book of the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel was a priest who had been living in Jerusalem during the first Babylonian attack on the city. And they spared the city, but they took a first wave of Israelite prisoners and hauled them off into exile, and Ezekiel was among them. So the book begins 5 years after all that, and Ezekiel is sitting on the bank of an irrigation canal near his Israelite refugee camp, and it's his 30th birthday, no less, the year that he would have been installed as a priest in Jerusalem. And then all of a sudden, Ezekiel has this vision. He sees a storm cloud approaching. And then inside the cloud are 4 strange creatures that have wings outstretched and touching each other. And these creatures each had 4 faces. And then he saw 4 wheels, one by each creature. And then he saw that the wings of the creatures were supporting this dazzling platform. And then on that platform is a throne. And then sitting on that throne is this human-like creature, glowing and shrouded in fire. And then all of a sudden Ezekiel realizes what he's seeing. He calls it the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. It's God riding his royal throne chariot. Now the word glory, in Hebrew it's kavod, it means heavy or significant. The biblical authors use this word to describe the physical appearance and manifestation of God's significance when he shows up in person. These images in the vision, they're very similar to what happened when God appeared on Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus. And it's also very similar to the depictions of God's presence over the Ark of the Covenant. And that's actually the most shocking thing about Ezekiel's vision. What is God's glory doing in Babylon? It's supposed to be above the Ark of the Covenant, in the temple in Jerusalem. And so the first section of the book opens to explore that question as Ezekiel begins to accuse Israel of rebellion. So God first speaks to Ezekiel from the throne chariot, and he commissions him as a prophet. Ezekiel is to accuse Israel of breaking their covenant agreement with God in a couple ways. Israel has given their allegiance to other gods and has been worshiping idols, and this has all led to rampant social injustice and violence. And so as a result, God appoints Ezekiel to warn the people. The first Babylonian attack that took Ezekiel into exile is going to be matched by another, and Jerusalem, its temple, all face imminent destruction. So Ezekiel uses words and more to get his message across. He also performs sign acts. These were a form of street theater. Ezekiel would go out in public and start behaving in these really bizarre ways that were like parables of his prophetic message. So he was supposed to build a tiny model of Jerusalem and then stage an attack on it. Or he was to shave off all of his hair and then chop it up with a sword. Or the most extreme, he was to play the role of the scapegoat on the Day of Atonement. And he would lay on his side for over a year, eating food cooked over poop, as a sign of the nasty food that people will have to eat during the siege of Jerusalem. And perhaps the most disheartening thing of all is the bad news God gave Ezekiel that no one was going to listen to him. Israel would reject him because of their rebellious and hard heart. And this recalls Moses' description of the people after the wilderness rebellions, when he predicted that exile would one day happen, and Ezekiel had the unfortunate privilege of seeing it all come to pass. And so a dismayed Ezekiel, he begins to perform his task. And after about a year, he has another vision. This one is about the temple. He goes on this virtual tour of the temple, and he sees what's happening there in his absence, and it is not good. In the outer courtyard in front of the temple, he sees this large idol statue. And then he sees the elders of Israel worshiping other gods, both outside and inside the temple. And then he sees the women of Israel. They're worshiping a Babylonian god named Tammuz, and the vision ends with God's chariot moving up and away from the temple. It's leaving, going east, headed towards Babylon. And so in chapter 11, we come to see why and how God's glory appeared to Ezekiel there in Babylon. Israel's idolatry and their covenant violations, it's become so blatant and offensive that God has left his temple. They've driven him away, and he consigns it to destruction. But God hasn't abandoned his people. Rather, he goes into exile with them. And so at the end of this vision in chapter 11, God promises that he will return a remnant of Israel back to the land, and he'll transform them by removing their heart of stone and giving them a new, soft heart of flesh, so that they can love and truly follow their God after all. This is a small glimmer of hope, and it's quickly submerged under the reality of the imminent destruction. But chapter 11 is a key transition, and it helps us understand how the rest of the book has been designed. So the next 3 sections are all announcements of God's judgment, first on Israel, then on the nations around Israel, and then on Jerusalem itself. But then after that, the hopeful conclusion of chapter 11 gets developed in the final 3 sections of the book. First, hope for Israel, then for the nations, and then for all creation. Chapters 12 through 24 focus on God's judgment coming to Israel. And this is a diverse collection of poems and essays. And here Ezekiel shows his fondness for parable and allegory. So he depicts Israel as a burnt, useless stick, or as a rebellious wife, or as a dangerous, raging lion that gets captured, or as 2 promiscuous sisters. These are all depictions of Israel's senseless rebellion and idolatry that results in their ruin. In this section, Ezekiel also acts like a lawyer. He begins arguing the case that, first of all, Jerusalem's destruction is truly deserved after centuries of covenant violation, and that even if the most righteous people in the world, like Noah or Daniel or Job, were alive and praying for God to spare Israel, God would not accept their prayers. It's far too late. And so God's goodness actually demands that he bring justice on this generation of Israel. The exile has become inevitable. They've reached the point of no return. Following this, Ezekiel focuses first on the nations immediately around Israel, and then on the 2 most powerful states in the region, Egypt and then Tyre. Israel has allied with these nations and adopted their gods and their idols, and so God accuses the kings of Tyre and Egypt for arrogantly viewing themselves as gods who get to define right and wrong on their own terms. And God holds these kings accountable for their pride, and he announces that he will use Babylon to bring them down. They will face God's justice along with everybody else. Following these really intense sections is a short story in chapter 33. Ezekiel's met by a refugee who's just arrived from Jerusalem, and he gives them the report that Babylon has attacked the city of Jerusalem, that the city has fallen, and the temple is destroyed. Ezekiel's grim warnings have become a reality. But remember, the end of chapter 11, that's not the end of the story. And so in the next video, we'll explore Ezekiel's profound vision of hope. But for now, that's the first half of the book of Ezekiel.
Okay, so that's our introduction to the book, and we will come to chapter 1 and try to pick apart the various components of his first vision next week. Any comments, questions that you have on anything that we talked about tonight?
Did Ezekiel know Daniel?
That's a great question. We think that it potentially, because I think the text tells us there were like 10,000 people that were taken captive to Babylon. That's a lot of people, but it's not necessarily, overwhelming amount of people. So potentially, yes, I would say.
Well, Daniel was kind of a big dog, so he would probably be known, I would think. So.
Well, yeah, you're right. I mean, when he kind of moves up the ranks, really, of Nebuchadnezzar's royal court. Ezekiel will definitely know of him.
Right.
I think that Daniel would know of Ezekiel. When you get to see some of the bizarre things that Ezekiel does to communicate the message, I'm sure news came to the court and said, "Have you seen that idiot that's in
Yeah.
the corner?" type thing, you know. So that's about the best we can do to know whether they knew each other.
Ezekiel seems like Daniel when they're talking about these creatures and stuff. These weird.
You're exactly right, Beth. Daniel, now he's interpreting dreams.
Yeah, but he's
Okay,
still
but you still
talking.
have some very similar weird visions. Yeah.
Yeah. And I found that river, my study Bible has it that it connects to the Euphrates River. It's just a
Okay.
little,
Yeah.
the Kabar River.
What about the aliens explanation?
What?
Have you,
Oh,
have you seen?
we'll talk about that next week. Is this a UFO type thing?
Right. There's been a lot of speculation around that.
Yeah. So
And ET.
hey, there's that vision that we'll look at next week. I mean, it's been viewed from a variety of different angles. It really has. So we'll make a point of trying to see what some of the people say about that particular interpretation. So
It might be sacrilegious, but is it possible that any of these people were using drugs? I mean, I know among them Native Americans, American in the North and South America, the priests, some of them used some drugs to get to see visions. You know, fasted, went on missions into the wilderness until they saw a vision brought on by whatever.
Yeah. That's a great point. That is a very good point. I think when we take the text and we make it real churchy, a lot of times what will happen is all of this was divinely initiated. But what we find is that in religions all around the world, a lot of the traditions or actions sometimes are to prompt visions or prompt some type of connection with the divine. So I think that's an angle that's worth considering and talking about. Whether or not we are able to conclude anything about it or not, but I think it's a very good angle to keep in mind that in religions around the world, encounters with God is not just divinely initiated. Sometimes humans are trying to prompt that connection as well. So good, great question, great point. Anybody else? All right, so we're going to have some fun, okay? Now, the one thing I want you to do in this study is not to get frustrated, because there will be things that you're not going to figure out. I'll tell you up front, okay? But if you keep in mind what the role of this scroll is in the life of the nation, it will help you, I think, to understand that when scholars say, we don't know what's going on here, it's okay, all right? So just give you that permission to be frustrated at times, and it's okay not to have an airtight answer to some things, okay? All right, well, we'll close shop here, and we'll look at chapter 1 next week, all right?
Okay.
All right. Okay, have a good night,
Night.
everybody.
Night.
All right.
Night.
Good night.